The second thing is you have to respond. When God speaks, you have to respond. Verse 4 tells us that after Abraham heard the promise and the call of God, it says these simple words, "So Abram left as the Lord had told him." What a simple statement. What a simple sentence. Abram heard the call of the Lord, and then the Scripture makes it this plain. And so he left. He didn't make a list of positives and negatives, and, well, it's more positive to go than not. He didn't ask a bunch of questions. He didn't say, "Lord, that's a big thing. Let me pray about it for a month or two, and I'll get back with you." He didn't. We're not told that he did any of that. It just simply says, "And he left." He left, just as God had told him to. Following after God requires that we respond when we hear His call. When God puts a period at the end of a sentence or a statement, it's not our place to change it to a question mark. But in our society today, we want to question everything. And we've translated that to our faith to the point where stepping out in faith has become something that we just aren't often willing to do. In the book, How Life Imitates the World Series, Dave Boswell tells the story of Earl Weaver, who was the former manager of the Baltimore Orioles. Weaver had a rule that no one could steal a base unless they were given the signal to steal. Some of you will remember Reggie Jackson. He was a great baseball player, and he certainly knew he was a great baseball player, and he didn't like that rule. He felt that he knew the pitchers and the catchers well enough to judge when he could steal a base and who he could steal a base from. And so one game he just decided that he would steal, even though Weaver had not given him the sign. He got off to a good jump and easily beat the throw to the second base. He stood up and dusted the dirt off his uniform. He smiled with delight, thinking that he had vindicated himself to his manager, that his judgment had been right. Well, later Weaver pulled Jackson aside and explained why he hadn't been given the sign to steal. The next batter in the lineup was a gentleman by the name of Lee May. Next to Reggie Jackson, he was the second best hitter on the team. When Jackson stole second base, first base was left open. So all you baseball fans, when you have a power hitter that's up and you have an open base, what do? You walk him. You intentionally walk him, which is exactly what the other team did. It took the bat out of May's hands. You know who was up after May? Well, I don't remember either, and the story didn't tell me. Probably because that batter was not as accomplished. In fact, it was a batter who hadn't proved to be very good against the pitcher for that game, that day. So Weaver felt that he had to send in a pinch hitter to try to make up for the difference, to try to drive the men on base home. That left Weaver without a bench that was strong enough later in the game when he really needed the pinch hitter. You see, the problem was Jackson only saw his relationship to the pitcher and the catcher. Weaver saw Jackson's relationship to the entire game. And because Jackson did only what he thought was right, it ruined the strategy for the rest of the team. We too only see so far. We only see things in relationship to our circumstance, to our place in life. But God sees the bigger picture. And so when He sends us a signal, it's wise to obey. We may not see the entire picture. We may not understand why He's asking us to do what He's asking us to do. We may want to run and He's saying stay. He may say stay when we need to run. We may want to hold on and He's saying go. We only see part of the picture. And folks, God may not answer all of our questions. He may not lay out the entire portrait in front of us. He may not explain His reasoning, but He gives us this promise. It came in Matthew 18:20 when Jesus said, "Remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." The question is, will we be people who respond or people who question? People who are willing to let God paint the portrait, or people who only are willing to see our particular part of it? Folks, it's not easy. And some of us may be superstars who think we've got it figured out. And the coach is sitting back saying, wait a minute, you don't understand. Nate Saint was one of 5 missionaries who were killed by the Akua Indians. He once said that his life did not change until he came to grips with the idea that, quote, obedience is not a momentary option. It is a die-cast decision that has been made beforehand, end quote. His point is, the decision to respond comes well before God actually speaks. If you're going to follow after God, you got to be listening. And when He does speak, you have to already have determined that you're going to respond and go where He's asking you to go. The third quality is one of trust. Following after God is costly. And we have to trust that in the end He will give what is necessary and what we need. Indeed, Jesus said this about following. He said, if any of you will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. And that's in Luke 9, verses 23 and 24. Folks, we have to trust that when we respond, God's going to give us what we need, and He's going to provide for us. And sometimes that means putting things at risk. Sometimes that means surrendering things that are important to us. And sometimes those come back many times over, and sometimes they do not. But that doesn't change the level of our trust. For as Paul says, in all things I have found to be content, in much or in little. Think about what Abram was asked to give up. When God spoke to him, He said, leave your country, your people, your father's house. That's what He said in verse 1. He asked Abram to leave his country, to leave that land that was familiar to him, to leave his kinfolk, to leave his family behind. Right there, many of us would be disqualified. To go to some place that we've never been, don't know anything about, and to do so without the aid and comfort of our family, that enough would be enough for us to stand and cry like the ant. What do I do? Where do I go? And yet Abram was willing. He gathered up his wife, his kids, his nephew, said goodbye to his father, and began his journey. Now the Scripture says that he gathered up all of his possessions, all of his wealth, all of his people. He was willing to put all of that at risk too. Abram had done rather well for himself where he was. And now he's going to move to this place unsure of what his future is going to be. No job security, no investment security, just the promise that God would bless him and all the world through him. He risked his health. Did y'all catch that little note in there about how old Abram was when God asked him to pack up and make this journey? 75 years old. And think about the part of the world where he's at. I mean, loading up all your possessions on camels and donkeys and whatever else and traipsing through the sand and the desert halfway around the known world at that time, well, that's just not an easy journey. And to do it at the age of 75? And to risk his family in the process as well? I mean, after all, dangerous was travel in those days. There weren't paved roads. There weren't the protections of state police. You didn't know if you would get ambushed. You didn't know what weather you would find. You didn't know what route you would take. How many of us would be willing to risk our families with such uncertainty? You kind of get the picture that I'm offering to you, don't you? All Abram had was a simple trust that God said He would bless me, and that's enough for me. He laid aside the familiar. He laid aside the support of his family. He laid aside his finances. He put his family and himself on the line. Regardless of whatever the cost was going to be, Abram trusted that God would take care of him. The Scripture says in verse 5, he took all the possessions that he had gathered. All his eggs were in one basket. There wasn't any hedging of his bet. There wasn't this fallback plan. Sometimes I think we do not ultimately get to those places where God is leading us because we are not willing to sell out everything to get there. Because as long as we're trying to hold on to what's back here, we can't move forward to what's up there. And some of us get to the very end of that rubber band, to the very end where it's stretched to the most, when we're just about to break through and we stop. That's all the tension that we can handle.